Welcome to another exciting episode of the Collect and Destroy podcast. I am your host, the Baxter of Puppets. Without further ado, I would like to introduce my special guest today, Dr. Nate Fehlauer from the Van Halen Institute of Higher Learning. Nate and I have studied extensively together the mystic arts of rock and roll and have shared on many a gander of epic concert events throughout the years, from Dokken to Van Halen, Megadeth to Rat, the Mighty Scorpions, Guns N' Roses, Tool, Roger Waters, and Sebastian Bach, to name a few. From humble beginnings at the gateway of Cranberry Country to the intergalactic airwaves today, Nate Fehlauer, welcome back to the show, buddy.
Wow, what can I say about that? That's amazing. Always good to see you, Baxter.
Good to have you.
Even if it's on a video screen here.
It's true. Just going to reach out and touch someone.
Yeah, I wish we could hug each other, but, you know, that's highly illegal.
Punishable by death. So what have you been up to, man?
Yeah, just kind of enjoying what I call middle early winter here in Wisconsin.
That's true.
Starting to get pretty cold. Yeah, not to be confused with late early winter, which will be coming probably next week here. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what have you been doing to pass time? I know you're a reader. Any books? Anything like that?
Yeah, I had some good opportunities for reading last week. I went deer hunting, and for me, that kind of means, that means sitting in the woods, staring at trees, not seeing animals come by, and reading books. So I have a couple actually that I picked up to read. The first one is called and it's by Adrian McKinty. It's kind of a twisted psychological thriller. It has to do with the concept of, imagine if one of your loved ones got kidnapped and you got a random phone call and they said to get your person back, you had to not only pay a ransom, but also kidnap another person to keep the chain going.
Holy crap.
And so on and so on. So it's just kind of a weird, twisted, kind of, messed up kind of book.
You said that's called The Chain?
It's called The Chain.
All right. That's cool.
Yep. So that was kind of fun. And another book that kind of sense for tonight is Running with the Devil by Noel Monk, who was the manager of Van Halen, actually back in the David Lee Roth era. So that kind of made sense. That was a very informative book. I highly recommend that for anyone that wants to know more about the early years.
I think that sounds awesome because I haven't read that one, but Van Halen is such a band where everyone has like their own side to the story. Whether you're, in the Sammy camp or the Dave camp or the Van Halen brothers kind of on their own camp, so to speak. So it's got to be good to have like an outsider who's also on the inside.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, he's with them every day, each tour. Doesn't have as much like in studio as I would have liked, probably,
Sure.
Information about the actual making of the albums. But it talks about life on the road, which is always good for a few stories about hotel fights with fire extinguishers in the halls and throwing TVs out windows and that sort of thing.
Awesome.
The other thing is we just finished the series Queen's Gambit, which I believe you guys are watching.
So good. We just finished it as well.
Super good. I mean, I always believed that, chess was like the ultimate game. So it's kind of just cool to see a movie that can actually make that interesting, I guess. Two people playing chess.
Yeah, I feel like I've heard from a lot of people who don't know how to play chess who have loved that show as well.
Yeah.
For me, so I started playing chess with friends again on my phone, and which is just like a very slippery slope. I feel like it's like gambling for me because then I'm just I'm like addicted to playing chess with complete strangers. But
cool.
Yeah, what a great show. It's just, it's funny because if it was a movie, I feel like it would be like Best Picture.
Yeah, I was just saying that same thing. It's like, so was this going to win an Emmy or something? Like what?
Yeah.
It deserves an Oscar. It was so weird, yeah.
But if it was 2 hours, there's no way you could like develop the characters and build that whole story. Like it just had such a great arc to it.
Yeah, very cinematic. Very cool.
So let's jump right into things. I mean, obviously, the reason that we're here is to pay tribute to the great Van Halen and pay tribute to the late great Eddie Van Halen, who we owe so much to in the world of rock and roll. I'll start out with a brief description just to get people up to speed who might not be super familiar with the band's history. But Van Halen is an American rock band formed in Pasadena, California in 1974. They are credited with restoring hard rock to the forefront of the music scene. And Van Halen are known for their energetic, over-the-top live show and for the virtuosic talent of its prodigy lead guitarist, Eddie Van Halen. From 1974 until 1985, Van Halen consisted of their most famous lineup of guitar hero, Eddie Van Halen, Eddie's brother, Alex Van Halen on drums, and the energetic, over-the-top vocalist, David Lee Roth, with bassist vocalist, Michael Anthony. All of that era's 6 albums have been certified diamond or multi-platinum. As the story continues in 1985, Roth decides to leave the band to embark on a solo career and is replaced by former Montrose lead singer Sammy Hagar. With Hagar, the group released 4 U.S. #1 multi-platinum albums over the course of 11 years. So then fast forward to 1996, Sammy decides to leave the band as well. At this point, the band is in flux. You've got Dave comes back for a minute. They've got a failed attempt to have the former Extreme frontman Gary Cherone join the band. Sammy comes back. Dave comes back. It's all over the place. The band last played in 2015. A farewell tour unfortunately never occurred because of Eddie's recent passing in October. And after he had a lengthy battle with cancer. So with all that being said, when's the first time you heard Van Halen? What are your earliest memories of the band? And like, what did you take from that sound when it first passed through your ear passages?
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about the early 80s. So, I mean, I was pretty young, I guess, when the first few albums came out, being born in 73. So I was, maybe, 8 to like 10 years old when the good stuff was coming out. I mainly remember it from, that was the MTV era, the early 80s. You had music videos. They were actually playing a lot of music. It was a great place to actually find out about new bands and new music.
They played music on TV?
Yeah, they had music. And there was like videos, there was pictures, movie pictures.
So it was like music television.
It was almost like,
MTV, music television.
To make it short, to explain it, you'd be like MTV, music television. So yeah, videos were awesome. And like, that was a great way pretty much as a band, you had to have awesome videos in order to get your music out at the time. So I just remember mainly for them just being, kind of crazy looking dudes and like real happy and jumping on the stage and just getting wild antics and the big jumps from David Lee Roth. Of course, the blazing guitar work of Edward. And I just remember, videos, it just made them look like these crazy dudes. They were having fun up there, jumping around. Edward's smile. Alex with his shirt off and his famous headband, huge gong behind him. Visually, I guess, it just made a huge impact, even over the music, the rock scene at the time. I was super young. I was like 10 years old, but I was starting to get into music. So I kind of just remember them being a band that's like, yep, this is the rock and roll that I really dig.
Yeah, as a kid, I didn't have MTV, and I'm a little bit younger than you. So I remember it was, through osmosis that this band is played on the radio. It wasn't really my parents' thing. My mom likes Van Halen, but I think she had other interests and styles of music that were popular at the time. My dad was more into things like The Who and the Beatles and Led Zeppelin. So Van Halen was like kind of more, like you said, it's more like this California band. I've even heard them, before hair bands, they had what they called teeth bands, because in all the videos they're smiling the whole time.
You could be in one of those. I think you fit in really good with that smile.
I always have thought of myself kind of like a Kip Winger kind of character up there.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Very fast.
So like previous to like the 80s glam scene, you've got these bands, and one takeaway from the videos though is how happy they are. Like they're always smiling. It's always a party. It's always fun. There's no like edgy side. There's no pouty side to it. But Laser 103 in Milwaukee, that's where I can say I've heard the most Van Halen growing up. It was always on the radio. So it's just something that I grew up around. And if you look at their albums, and we're going to get into their albums in a little bit, there's hits on every single album. Starting in 1978 all the way through 1995. So that's like my entire childhood is nonstop singles that are played on the radio. So it was pretty awesome. We both actually saw Van Halen for the first time in 2013 at Rock USA in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. That was an awesome day. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing that was so amazing about that is I remember you and I like working together and listening to Van Halen and just kind of dreaming about if David Lee Roth could ever rejoin them, right?
Yeah.
Like it just seemed like a crazy thing to talk about. It was up there with like talking about Guns N' Roses getting back together or something like that, which also happened. But yeah, so that day was just, it was just an amazing lineup as well. It was started with Jackal, and then it went to Don, and then Rat was there, and the night ended with Van Halen. With David Lee Roth. Like a dream come true. It was like a rock and roll lovers like perfect show almost.
Oh yeah, it was so great. And we went with our friend Justin, who we worked with for many years, part of the quote unquote Big Four from Hartman.
That's right.
And yeah, like you said, it's weird because Jackal, Dokken, Rat, and Van Halen, you would normally think they would throw bands on that lineup that we would be like, oh, I don't want to see those. Some modern like butt rock bands that we would have no interest in. And they were like, no, we're just going to go pure 80s, give you exactly what you want. Very limited lineup. And it was like, if I recall, it was like lawn chair seating. So it was like you just like sat wherever.
Yeah, general admission, but lawn chair, like get your chair out, where you want to sit. And it's kind of cool because, yeah, with the exception of Jackal, those are kind of all like early 80s rockers too. Dokken and Rat were there kind of from the beginning as far as the glam scene. Yeah,
and like Jackal was a great opener because I wouldn't be interested in seeing a Jackal headlining show, but as like a warm-up band, it makes sense because they were like that post 80s scene.
Right. And every warm-up band should really start out with chainsaw. That always have a chainsaw if you're going to start out a show.
That's what I was going to say. Like, that's all I'm waiting for at a Jackal show is for them to play the chainsaw song, and then I'm done. So, you're kind of hanging out, chilling, and having a great time, and the chainsaw song plays, and then they're off the stage, and we're all good.
Yep. Then you get a little break. Yeah. Yeah. The only thing was that George Lynch wasn't there, and I think Warren was there. Warren DeMartini was there.
I think so.
It's hard to remember, but I know for sure George Lynch wasn't there, which was kind of a bummer, but anyway, it was cool.
Yeah. The Van Halen, the actual performance though was like magical because like you said, we assumed we would never see that again. You just kind of like wrote it off like that wasn't going to happen. So seeing Dave up there twirling his like staff and doing his karate moves and
doing
like
some soft shoe.
Yeah, it just you dream about that, especially when you put it out of your mind. It's like Axl hitting the stage with Slash. You just kind of put it out of your mind, like, yeah, that'd be great. It's kind of like us waiting for the Pink Floyd reunion of Waters and Gilmore.
Yep.
Like it's like anywhere it happens, we'll be there.
Could happen. I swear it can happen.
Yeah, it can. I think too, people's opinions soften with age because they realize there's never going to be a chance. And
right.
The one that I thought would happen, this is going off a little bit, but the one that I thought would happen after the Guns N' Roses was Skid Row. I thought for sure we'd get Sebastian back in Skid Row. I even thought Skid Row might go out with Guns N' Roses. And
that would be great. Yeah.
those guys just don't want to
No,
reconcile.
That seems very unlikely that that'll happen. Unfortunately,
Just get separate tour buses and
yeah. Come on, how much money will it take? Come on, just do it.
I'm very interested to see ZP from Dragon Force though as the new Skid Row singer. So that's kind of cool.
I'd go to that.
But Sebastian, man, he's something else. It's good stuff.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that he was actually at one point considered to join Van Halen in that period with looking for a new singer. Yeah, I was very surprised to hear that, but I did.
I believe he was asked to join Guns N' Roses at one point too. It might have been Velvet Revolver.
Oh, okay.
But because of his friendship with Axl, I think he turned it down. So he didn't want to step on any toes and create a weird situation.
Yep.
That sound, ladies and gentlemen, means it's time for the ranking. Today, Nate and I will be ranking each of our top 5 Van Halen albums. I'll run through my list 5 through 1, followed by yours, Nate, and then the debate and discussion shall commence, starting with our number 1s and working backwards from there.
Oh.
All right. So,
okay.
On my list, number 5, I have OU812. Number 4, I have Van Halen 2. Number 3, I have Women and Children First. Number 2, I have 1984. And number 1, I have the self-titled debut Van Halen from 1978. On your list, Nate, you have number 5, Women and Children First. Number 4, 1984. Number 3, you have Fair Warning. Number 2, you have the self-titled debut. And number 1 from 1979, you have Van Halen 2. So, Nate, I'm going to offer you the floor with your number 1 pick, Van Halen 2. Hit me with it.
Your list is crazy. Look at that. This is the first I saw your list here, by the way. Yeah, so, okay. I'm just kind of letting that sink in a little bit here. I thought for sure you would have Fair Warning in there. What the heck?
It's not even in my top 5.
That's wild. Okay. Yeah, so this was a very hard thing to do. This is almost as hard as trying to choose greatest Indiana Jones movies of all time that kind of did last. Actually, that was easier. I just think, they only had one album that wasn't really awesome in the David Lee Roth era. So it was just kind of a matter of you're talking like percentage wise, these are all up in like the 90 percentile. Up in there. And I think the main thing is that I was looking for was I wanted all the greatest aspects of Van Halen to be in every song on the album. Okay, I wasn't just looking for an album that had a couple of awesome hits that I loved. I was looking for an album that had solid tracks from start to finish. And that would mean I want to hear the David Lee Roth, the swagger. I want to hear him screeching. One place I read, they described it perfectly as a stuck pig squeal. I want to hear that in the songs. I want to hear him riffing on the breakdowns. I want to hear him mumbling away with his cryptic whatever he's talking about. Sometimes you don't know. I want to hear Eddie, of course, unique solos in each song with tapping and harmonics. I want to hear Alex pounding away back there. And I want to hear Michael Anthony, especially those background vocals. So having said that, that's why I went with Van Halen 2, because I kind of felt like, okay, as far as the first 2 albums, almost feeling like a double album of all the stuff they played in backyards and in the clubs, I felt like Van Halen 2 was kind of the refreshing breath of fresh air after the Hitmaker original album. I just felt like all the songs are solid. They give you everything you want, but they're not those big hits that you hear over and over on the radio. And it's just something kind of fresh. Some of the standouts after the first 2 songs are kind of slow to bring you in. with You're No Good and Dance the Night Away. Then you kind of suddenly break into Somebody Get Me a Doctor, where David Lee Roth is like, basically, let's start the party. You know, you're warmed up. You guys come on in. It starts with those big chords. He's revving it up. He says, feeling no pain, overloaded down the drain. I mean, he's getting the party going with that one. And then it just picks up from there. You got Bottoms Up. You got Out of Love Again. Those are definitely 2 top 10 songs, at least in my book. You end it with Dead or Alive. Love the line, found a dirty faced kid in the garbage can. I mean, it's lines like that Dave comes up with. They're just like, what is he talking about? But that's kind of cool. You know, you're talking from the streets. And then Women in Love, it's got the harmonic tap intro, and you end it out with Beautiful Girls at the end there. Yeah, I just think it's a solid album start to finish.
Nice. Yeah, so for my I had that as my number 4. So I'll get to why it's not a number 1 later. But my number 1, I went with your number 2 pick, which is the self-titled album. I feel like that's a perfect album. That was kind of if I'm going to tell anybody to listen to one album that encompasses all of Van Halen, it's going to be that. You know, really, You Really Got Me is probably the biggest single. It's not my favorite song on the album. But you know, you can't deny coming out of the gate with Running with the Devil and Eruption. I mean, there's not much of a stronger 1-2 punch from Van Halen than those 2 tracks. And those are also so iconic, that thumping bass line, which is also how Dave Mustaine met David Ellefson, was him practicing that
That's
song.
right, yeah. Boom, 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 boom.
Yeah, killer. They, I found it interesting that they recorded it in 3 weeks' time. Most of the stuff was live tracked. There were just a few songs that had overdubs. And Eruption might be the greatest guitar solo of all time. Like,
sure,
talking about iconic, and memorable and all those things. So again, that's why I picked it as my number 1. When I look at the full catalog, that's the quintessential Van Halen album.
Yeah, I agree. I think when they went into the studio with that one, like I said, they had been playing these songs like over and over, like every week. So it was just like so tight, but at the same time, I guess what I want to say is they were so tight, and they were all really good playing like in a live setting together. But at the same time, it's like raw, because they did a lot of like first take, basically second take stuff, and they were playing, with each other. So you got like a live raw feel, but at the same time they were super tight, so they didn't have to take multiple takes.
You Really Got Me obviously is like one of their biggest hits and like a really good cover, but the John Brim cover of Ice Cream Man, like, is just amazing. Like, that's such a good choice, and it's got that it encompasses the David Lee Roth swagger. Like, there's something,
it's kind of a little bit tongue in cheek too, that they kind of became known for, like picking songs that you'd be like, you wouldn't really expect for cover songs. Nobody else.
I can't think of a single band that did that the way that they did it successfully.
Yeah, exactly. It was cool. Running with the Devil, first track on there, it starts with that tone that's actually created with their car horns. They took the horns out of their cars and put them in a box. And they used to do that, I guess, for live shows too. That like droning. That tone sounds like an air raid siren going off, right? To lead into that first album. And then, like you said, you hear that pounding bass line after that.
So interestingly, I was just recently listening to the Gene Simmons demo that Van Halen did with Gene Simmons. And on the track before Running with the Devil, they used that sound effect, like for just like a small little gap. They like use that sound.
Right.
The song ends, and then they use it like the normal length that you have Running with the Devil. So it was just cool, because when it first shows up, my ears peak up, because I'm like, oh, I know that sound. So That's interesting that you say that they use that live as well.
Yeah, they use that a bunch. Yeah. what else do I got? Yeah, I mean, like you were saying, Eruption, the guitar solo, it's kind of like people call it like the litmus test of you want to be a rock guitarist, you pretty much learn Eruption. You kind of feel like you need to know that to like prove yourself.
Yeah.
You know, of course I never learned it, but I was like just getting into bands and stuff actually when the 90s started. So I was more than happy that we were going into the grunge era of just pounding away on your guitar and not using so much finesse as far as soloing.
I remember in high school, there was a kid in my grade that I was friends with that I hung out with all the time. Matt Haas was his name. And he could play Eruption, and therefore he was the greatest guitarist I knew.
Yeah, right.
And I don't know if he still plays guitar to this day. Matt Haas, if you're out there, I still think about that. He lent me a guitar once in the time of need. But the fact that he could shred that out like nobody's business, it was like, yeah, this guy, it's just cool that all those years later, from 1978 until now, there's still those classic songs that are a scale of skill.
Yeah, I mean, another thing about, since we're just talking about their first album and how much impact that had, I was going to say, you know, just look at what else was going on in the mid to late 70s as far as music and why they stood out. And mainly like the Bee Gees, you know, you had disco, and then you had like punk bands like the Clash, Sex Pistols, and then you had sort of what I guess you could call prog rock stuff like Steely Dan and like Rush.
Yes.
Bands like that. Yeah. And, you know, those bands were cool, and there was also like bands that had like a heavy sound, you know, Scorpions and Deep Purple, AC/DC. But those bands, like you said earlier, like they didn't really they were heavy, but they didn't like look like they were having fun up there.
Yeah.
And there's certainly like no sex appeal. I mean, you're not looking at Rush, you know, you're not looking at Geddy Lee and finding that like California sexy long blonde hair guy running around. So I think that was kind of part of what made this album really stand out as well, was just that it was so different in that way. And the heavy sound, but also the fun aspect of it.
I know we're kind of talking about my one and your number two at the same time because it's the same album. But the last note I would just like to say is the song "On Fire" is one of my favorite songs, which is the very final song on the album.
Right.
And it's just blazing, and Dave's vocals are blazing. Like it's just a jam. I just want to say that much.
Yeah. Great ending to an album for sure.
So shall we move on? You good? Or you want any other notes on?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Just one more. This is like so random, I know, but
yeah, no problem.
You know, I was listening to these albums again, and I just happened to like pick up in my ear on "Ain't Talking About Love," like the solo section. I was like, that kind of sounds like a sitar almost in there. And I found out he actually did play an electric sitar on that, so as a double to his solo line.
Oh wow!
So he did like a double track. I don't know. That's just what you could call a fun fact.
If I had a bell, I would ring it.
That's where we need the bell right there.
Nate Fehlauer fun fact. Okay, so I'll move on to my number two now, which, even surprising to myself, was 1984. I think
that's shocking.
I think because of the song "Jump" alone, I was like, Ryan Baxter cannot pick this as his number two album. Because it's such a poppy hit song led by keyboards. And not that there's anything wrong with keyboards. Dio taught us that. But it just that kind of got in the way of me feeling like comfortable picking it. But once I listened to that album, you got Jump, you got Panama, Hot for Teacher, and probably my favorite song on the album, I'll Wait. Like, just it's an undeniably great album. Yeah, I mean
that's your favorite song is "I'll Wait"
on that album, probably. I mean, the obvious would be like "Hot for Teacher" or "Jump" or something like that, Panama. But
yeah,
there's just something about the song "I'll Wait," like I mean, the whole album sounds great, right? The auditory quality of it, all that time that was spent in Studio 5150. comes across. Interestingly, about "I'll Wait," though, that was a collaboration between Van Halen and Michael McDonald from the Doobie Brothers.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I forgot about that.
David Lee Roth was struggling to finish the lyrics, and so they brought in Michael McDonald. So he was only credited on the song in Europe, and on the U.S. release, he's not credited, even though he helped write it. I mean, maybe they thought they would like lose some credibility or something.
So what is that song about?
It is about. Do you know this or no?
I don't really know.
It's technically. It's really weird. There was a Calvin Klein underwear ad for it was like a woman wearing men's underwear, and they hung the picture up, and the song was about Dave serenading her.
Okay.
So
I knew it was about kind of a magazine ad, something.
Yeah, it's pretty vague. It's pretty obscure, but it was kind of like he's serenading this imaginary woman in this ad that he doesn't actually know.
So he's just saying he'll wait till they meet or something.
I guess. Yeah.
I don't know.
I couldn't.
I know
I
he
actually
talks about the pages of the magazine. Yeah. So
yeah, I looked a little bit more into it to try to find some more meaningful content to that. And I actually couldn't really discover any. Speaking of Michael McDonald and the Doobie Brothers, I was watching the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremonies for this year. It was on HBO, and the producer for the Doobie Brothers was Ted Templeman. So that's actually probably how Michael McDonald ends up in the mix. Is he's producing all the Van Halen albums prior to that album, and
that makes sense. Yeah.
A few last notes. Hot for Teacher. That's a song that stands out as me as a child hearing that for the first time on the radio, like not even being able to understand what I'm hearing. Like, where are all these drums coming from? Like, the drumming on there is phenomenal. I don't believe he played double bass, even though it sounds like double bass.
Okay. Yeah, that's iconic, think the lead in on that.
Yeah, I think a song like a band like Van Halen, you don't have like Slayer unless you have Van Halen. It's kind of weird to think about that. You don't have Pantera without Van Halen.
Yeah, I think the big thumping drums. Yeah, it probably came from John Bonham, and then it went to Van Halen, and then it passed on to a lot of the '80s bands.
Exactly, like Van Halen's kind of like that connection between the old rock and the new rock. Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's not a lot of peers to Van Halen from that era. Maybe Aerosmith, maybe.
Sure,
like,
yeah.
There's not like they're right on that fine line between the 80s LA explosion and the 70s classic rock before, like you said, like the prog bands and Black Sabbath and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, look at the lead men. I mean, Steven Tyler, flamboyant, stage presence and running around with all the scarves and all the crazy costumes. I mean, you're right. That is right in line with David Lee Roth with his wardrobe and his antics.
The early music videos, which were just like shot of them playing like on a soundstage, David Lee Roth looks like a spitting image of Robert Plant. Like the bell bottoms, the open shirt, like spitting image. Then he develops his own look. But
then he found the spandex.
My very last note on 1984 is just the significance of the keyboards, because he was trying to work it in before. He had worked it in on Women and Children First a very little bit, but he finally won the battle to get the keyboards in the band, and it paid huge dividends because it got him a #1 record. So
sure, yeah. I just think it's interesting that we went from their first album to their last, at least with David Lee Roth anyway, because there's a big difference in sort of how they approach the albums by that point.
Yes.
You're talking like 6 years or whatever, 5 or 6 years. And you can kind of see how Eddie, like you said, with his own studio at 5150, which this was the first album that he used his own studio and kind of had that freedom to, away from Ted Templeman, to do as he wanted and experiment more. Whereas Ted Templeman was looking for like the next big hit and mostly like guitar driven hits.
Yeah.
Not afraid to use cover songs either. He was always just looking for like an album with at least one big hit. So we're kind of coming off of like Fair Warning and Diver Down. So they were kind of changing their approach to the studio at this point. And I think Eddie kind of had his way a lot more on this album. He had a whole year to work on it. So therefore, you're seeing more keyboards and you're seeing a little less of maybe guitar on tracks.
Well, and after Diver Down, the Van Halen brothers are quoted as saying something about they would rather fail with original material than succeed any longer with covers.
Yeah.
And I mean, Diver Down was like, what, 5 covers? You're going to the well a few too many times.
I mean, we'll probably get to it in a minute. No, it's not on either a list there, but yeah, there's like 5 cover songs and like only 4 original songs, and then a couple instrumental songs thrown in there.
Well, we probably don't need to talk much about that album.
But yeah, we don't have to talk about too much. I mean, basically, we're getting off track 1984 here a little bit, but yeah, Diver Down, David Lee Roth wanted to basically just put a single out for that whole year. He wanted to put out, first it was Dancing in the Streets, but then they decided on Pretty Woman.
Sure.
He wanted to just put out as a single, and they ended up doing a whole album because the record company was like, you're putting out an album now. 1984, Eddie was in a lot more control. And this started the clash between him and David and Ted Templeman. So that kind of helped create this rift between those guys. And, as we'll probably talk in a little bit here, was kind of the beginning of the end, which caused Dave to leave the band. So, but yeah, great album. Let's see what else I got here. I don't know if we want to talk at this point about the cover art. It was amazing. It's one of the iconic covers with the cherub smoking the cigarettes.
Yep.
Great cover. I don't know what else you want to say about that. It was just a cool way to show like sort of innocence, but also like sort of like a sneaky side to like more of a dark path. Kind of brought people from like pop music in. That album too brought you from like pop music to more like rock music.
Yeah,
so it's kind of symbolic.
People were
in
like
that way.
dancing. People were like dancing to Jump. Like it was a dancing song.
Yeah, I think that's about all I got on that one.
All right. Well, let's move on to your number 3 then, which I actually, it's funny because we don't compare these lists prior to this unveiling. But the way that you had been talking about Fair Warning, I knew it was going to be on your list. And I was like kind of surprised, but I didn't want to let you know that I was surprised by that choice. So yeah. I wanna hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I was actually talking to you earlier today, and I kind of just switched. I had 1984 at number 3, mainly just because of the hits on that album. Though it's just like, of course, Jump and Panama and Hot for Teacher are all super awesome, hot, big hits, great rock songs. And it was kind of like a nostalgia for me, that's kind of like my gateway to Van Halen was watching that stuff. So yeah, I kind of had it in there, nostalgia, and I love the album. But then I was listening to Fair Warning recently. I was just like, this album is just the rocking, heavy album that's got some of the lyrics are kind of sinister, and it's got that kind of dark alley kind of feel to it. Super heavy, super fast tunes in there. Some people have called it like mysterious, brooding, and dangerous. And especially with that album cover, which is it's called The Maze. It's by this guy, William Kurelik. He actually, when he was in a psychiatric hospital. So, I mean, just like starting with that album cover, you can kind of get a sense these guys were thinking in a different way from like the Party Boys of like the first 2 albums. And then you hear a song like it opens with Mean Street, which is all about, life on the street, and is talking about like gun is kind of easy on the streets. And once it turns you from hunted into hunter, it's lyrics like that. And that really like heavy atmospheric breakdown in that song. Yeah. It's like a perfect start to that album because from then on, it just goes into like these real heavy rockers, sort of dark, just weird, twisted lyrics. Dirty Movies is talking about like a prom queen turned like a porn star. It's like, okay, we're not talking about just like partying and drinking beer anymore. We're talking like a little bit more kind of seedy aspect of like kind of living in the city life. You got awesome songs like Sinner's Swing. Just the fast, aggressive speed of that song. You're hearing a lot more like bass and drums on this album, I feel. Michael Anthony's a lot more exposed on this, as well as Alex's drum kits on this one. Unchained, of course. It's got to be one of your top 5 greatest, probably, of Van Halen songs.
I would say Unchained is definitely in my top 10 Van Halen songs. Like, so if there was anything from that album that I'm like into, that it would probably be that song, and probably only that song.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. I was surprised because the more I listened to it, I was like, this sounds like a Baxter kind of album. It's like heavier. It's like so many guitars and so many fast solos. But I was wrong.
I think partially though is like I like the teeth rock.
Yeah, you like the happy stuff.
I think that like it was a departure for their sound, and it wasn't one that I liked. And what's interesting is when David Lee Roth eventually leaves the band, he said that he wasn't into the sound that they were currently working on that sounded, and he used the word brooding.
Yeah.
So, you know,
it's worth noting too that, it's worth noting that this album actually had the worst sales so far, you know, this being the 4th album. The ones before this were just flying off the shelves or whatever, you know, flying out of the doors. And this one, they actually had to pay money to, you know, kind of get it on the radio. Actually, so
are you familiar with Rolling Stone's take on this album?
No.
So Rolling Stone gave this album 2.5 out of 5. And they said that the only thing worth anything on this album was the introduction of the keyboard.
Really? That's crazy.
So I didn't see that until I had already decided it wasn't going to make my top 5. But then when I saw it, I was like, I felt a little vindicated. I'm like, okay, I guess. And then you told me the fact about it not selling, and I'm like, okay, so but maybe it's just like one of those elite, like you're like a real Van Halen fan because you like that.
I think so. I'm hardcore. I go for the deep cuts.
But like you said earlier, these albums all rule. Like there's not.
They do. Yeah.
Of those first David Lee Roth albums, there's no bad ones.
Yeah, even the songs
even
the songs that go off like the usual, you know, the Van Halen feel, they're just kind of fun, like as like a break almost. You know.
Yeah.
Even some things on Diver Down. You know, I mean, little guitars on that on that album is great. I mean, they had at least one great song in Diver Down. But yeah, I just really love this album. And then you get to some of my, anyway, I was going to say, Push Comes to Shove. I mean, that is almost like a jazz funk reggae kind of feel. Sure. I don't know. It's like so different. Like I was just saying, it's like a fresh kind of feel for Van Halen sound. And like the phrasing and his solos on like that one. And also, So This Is Love. I mean, just the phrasing of his solos, he gets away from that like tapping and screeching stuff, and he gets more just kind of, I don't know if it's like bluesy or what. He almost sounds like a brass section a little bit on that, like almost like a saxophone or, you know, something, a different instrument. He goes for a different sound on some of those tracks, which I love.
Yeah.
And then you have Sunday Afternoon in the Park. That's where he's playing like a weird, I don't know if it's a keyboard or a Moog or whatever. It's that one that kind of just sounds like a weird, I don't know. It's just like a deep bass synthesizer. It's just kind of a totally different feel. I thought you would like that one because it was kind of spooky and almost like a horror soundtrack. I just don't know you anymore. Well,
I will say though too, like when you listen to a band so much that like anything that sounds remotely different from their catalog is like a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
So I mean, think of all the Beatles we've listened to and all the Led Zeppelin we've listened to and all the Rolling Stones we've listened to. And you're just like, give me something new that I don't know exists. Like then you find an album like Fair Warning, and it, like you said, it is a breath of fresh air. It is something where if they play anything off of it in the live situation, you're like, oh, this is great. It's something different. It's not Panama again.
Yeah.
So solid album. not a number 3, but
Not on your
we
list.
can't.
Although you
We
gotta,
can't. Yeah,
you do have a Sammy Hagar coming up.
yeah. We have a Sammy coming up. So the real number 3 in this debate is women and children first, um, which it could have been my number 2. I think maybe it's not number 2 because like as a whole, it's not as successful. But this is their 3rd studio album. Another hard rockin' 1-2 punch. You got "And the Cradle Will Rock" and "Everybody Wants Some" coming out of the gates. Like those songs are on fire. This is the record. So similar to what you were saying, this is the album where they start being a little more heavy. They're sonically heavier. They're thematically heavier. More studio overdubs and less emphasis on the backing vocals. A little fun fact would be on the opening track "And the Cradle Will Rock," it sounds like a guitar in the beginning, but it's actually a phase shifter affected Wurlitzer electric piano played through one of Van Halen's 1960s model 100-watt Marshall Plexi amplifiers. So, Eddie was always manipulating sound and trying to get unique original sounds. So that's just a good example of that. And also on this album, he starts to do a little bit more Hendrix worship in the way he plays his solos, in the way he plays his riffs. "Take Your Whiskey Home," that's like a jam. And that song was written much earlier. But when you look at how fast they were releasing albums, they were releasing an album a year. So if they wrote the song 3 years ago and it didn't make it on an album yet, it seems like it's really old when it's only maybe a few years old. And the last thing would just be "Could This Be Magic" is just like super catchy. So that's my number 3 and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, "Could This Be Magic?" Apparently David Lee Roth played some acoustic guitar on that track too, which is kind of cool.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I really love that down and dirty, bluesy, acoustic kind of feel. And I think it's Eddie playing slide on that. It was like one of the first times he'd ever actually even played a slide guitar. Like I think
really?
Ted Templeman just said, "Hey, you want to try some slide guitar?" And he was like, "All right." Grabbed a slide and just started sliding away,
And he was instantly the second greatest slide guitarist of all time.
I know, yeah. Yeah, I just love "Everybody Wants Some." Like, what a weird song, like the tribal beat and just the weird, sort of improv lyrics that David Lee Roth is throwing out in there. I'm surprised you don't have a hamburger graphic of hamburger playing guitar for this one. It was so cool that was used in "Better Off Dead," and like it was written in as like a weird dream in that movie. Yeah. Everyone knows that one. What else did I have about that? "Fools" is a great song. "Youthful Rebellion" with that beat, and like he's talking about sick and tired of the golden rules. I mean, it's just a rebellious kind of attitude. "Romeo Delight." I love the guitar and bass and the solo section. I wish we had some samples we could play during this, but
you can just imagine.
Everyone go check that out. Yeah, "Romeo Delight."
Hit the pause button on your podcast right now. "Romeo's Delight."
Yeah.
Listen to it, come back, push play.
Yeah, hopefully everyone kind of got that queued up on the side, all the Van Halen tracks. Yeah, I mean, great album. I had it as number 5. It was in there.
You talking about tracks you had mentioned earlier, it's like with so many good songs and such a robust catalog, it's hard to keep all the songs straight and which albums they're on. So if you're listening to this and you're completely confused at this point, it's completely normal. But we've been doing nothing but consuming Van Halen for the last few weeks. So
we have, and it's a little odd jumping around, like I said, from like first album, 1984. Now we're going to jump into some Sammy Hagar, and it's a huge catalog.
Number 4, you had 1984. Did you have anything else you wanted to add to that? We kind of covered that pretty extensively.
Not really. I think there was one point. There's one track on there I was kind of almost feeling like just today I was listening to, and I was like, this almost sounds like something that could be a Hagar era.
Sure. Yeah.
"Drop Dead Legs" to me Next
Yeah.
time you listen to that, think of Sammy singing that. It seems just perfect. You kind of just see how they were sort of changing into what would become the Van Hagar.
So speaking of Van Hagar, yeah, I knew I would catch you off guard with this because when we first talked about this, we were like, "There's no way that Sammy makes the top 5." Like David Lee
I thought we
Roth is
agreed on
like.
that. I thought we agreed. What are
Well,
you doing here?
the
You're going
problem
off
here is
script.
that the problem here is that I'm a fan of like all Van Halen other than Gary Cherone, but the I'm a fan of Van Halen and I like the Hagar stuff, but when you start listening to it like as to analyze it and apply your 8 qualities of scientific reasoning applied to each song per album,
Yeah.
I was listening to these Hagar albums and I'm like, holy crap, are these good? Like, and you talk about hits, like it's consistent. The 1978 album hits, 79 hits, 80 hits, 1981 hits, 82 hits, 84 hits. Their singer leaves. They have a new singer. They come out of the gate with 3 more hits. And everything for that next 11 years is multi-platinum with Sammy Hagar. The weird thing is that
5150.
yeah, so yeah, that's 5150. We got 3 songs. Then we get to the one that I picked, which also
okay.
has like 4 has like 4 hits on it, which is now 1988 OU 812. So it's almost a new band at this point. That's the hard part. Like you almost want it to be like David Lee Roth is one band, and now they start a completely new band, and that way I can compare it. It's like comparing Van Halen and Aerosmith, 2 similar genres but completely different bands. So when it comes to OU 812, this is the second album that they do with Sammy. I thought that 5150 is a good album, but I thought that OU 812 was like when they had gelled, like they had really come together and started defining their own sound instead of trying to insert Sammy into something before and then kind of trying to adjust like the Sammy Hagar solo sound to Van Halen. And first and foremost, OU 812, the sound quality sonically in the headphones. I noticed that was, to me, like it seemed like it was the best Van Halen has sounded yet sonically. The blazing drum beat out of the gates on the first song, Mine All Mine. I feel like it's that next evolutionary step for the Sammy era. And honestly, I'm a sucker for a good ballad. So like When It's Love, that's a killer ballad. I love it. That's one thing you didn't have. You didn't really have David Lee Roth ballads. The band became more like emotional and more meaningful. Like Van Halen with Dave was like not a meaningful band. It was more of a party band. And then the Sammy thing, there was more like of a message and more like, which was also the sign of the times. You're in the late 80s now. People start to become more socially aware. It's less about the excess of the early 80s where everyone's just partying and doing drugs and it's awesome. And now it's starting to become like people are becoming more socially conscious about the environment and the political stratosphere, the international politics. Fun fact with this album, the album cover pays tribute to the Beatles. Fab Four's 1964 album with the Beatles. So they kind of try to imitate that. And then the guitar solo on When It's Love is a nod to Eric Clapton. That's another little Fehlauer fun fact for you.
It's what? Eric Clapton?
Yeah. The When It's Love is a nod to Eric Clapton.
Oh, it's a nod to. Okay. I thought you said it was Eric Clapton.
Yeah. No, yeah. So favorite songs on the album, Mine All Mine, When It's Love, Cabo Wabo, Source of Infection. I feel like everyone shines on Source of Infection. The lead vocals, the backup vocals, the guitars and the drums are on fire. Michael Anthony is one of those carryovers from the previous version. Like you need Michael Anthony doing backup vocals for it to be Van Halen. If there's no Michael Anthony, it's not Van Halen. He's such an important he's more important as a backup vocalist than he is as a bass player.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
I think later they actually did use just his vocals and not his bass, but we'll get to that. I'm talking way later.
I just realized we skipped my number 4.
Yeah, but
which
we already
was
talked about Van. Yeah,
Van
but that was my
Halen
number
2.
1.
Yeah, but I had some other notes on that we didn't get to. We're just gonna bounce all over the place. So
Yeah,
my number
just,
5 was
edit that in later.
812. Do you have anything else to add about the Sammy stuff, that album in particular?
I would just say that album. I think Finish What You Started was on that album.
Yes, it was.
And I always kind of thought that was kind of a different, catchy kind of tune with him playing that clean guitar, just like a clean sound, and it was kind of that funky little snappy little tune.
Yeah, that was like one of the cool things was Sammy was a guitarist. So the story behind that song is that Sammy went over to Eddie's house and they stayed up all night jamming acoustic guitars, and he didn't leave until they finished that song.
Right.
And I think that was a cool component for Eddie. Like, it was very rewarding and fulfilling to have another musician that could, like, Sammy was a solo artist that played guitar and he was known for shredding. Like,
yeah.
So when you've got the greatest guitarist of the era and then in walks a second guitarist that doesn't need to play lead, creates some cool stuff.
Yeah.
So the only things I wanted to add about my number 4, which was Van Halen 2, was I was surprised you picked it as your number 1, because to me it was actually a regression from the first album. And I say that because
it's crazy talk.
The songs on that album sound more in line with the times than the first album. The first album was like groundbreaking. It was like creating a new sound. And then the second album, it felt like they were playing poppier songs that were more like that late 70s classic rock.
Yeah.
Which appeals a little less to me. Dance the Night Away is great. I love Beautiful Girls. Somebody Get Me a Doctor is probably the best song on that album to me. And fun fact, the black and yellow guitar on the back of the album, known as the Bumblebee, he didn't actually play it on the album, but that was Dimebag Darrell from Pantera's favorite Eddie Van Halen guitar. So when Dimebag passed away, he was buried in a Kiss coffin, and Eddie Van Halen placed that guitar in the coffin with him. He said something about that. I don't know if you recall.
Yeah. Who said? Oh, what did Eddie say?
Yeah. Didn't he say something about him deserving that guitar?
Oh yeah, he said an original deserves an original. Because that's Vinny talked to Vinny and Dimebag had just recently met Eddie at a show, and Dimebag had talked to Eddie about buying a guitar from Eddie that Eddie would build and Dime would buy, and they didn't get a chance to do that. I think Dimebag actually wanted to buy one that was already existing, but Eddie said, "No, I'll build one for you."
Sure. Yeah.
Like, okay. And we never got a chance to do that. And after Dimebag got killed, Vinny messaged Eddie, and he was like, is there any way like you could, make a guitar and we can put it with him in the casket? And Eddie said, that's when he said an original deserves an original. He gave him the actual guitar to put in there. Yeah, it's just amazing. Yeah, I don't know. The rest of the story about why that was so important to the brothers in Pantera.
No.
It's they were huge fans. Vinny and Dime were huge fans, and so they grew up listening to Van Halen. They always loved Eddie, and they would actually get pumped up to go out on stage. And the signal for them to like let loose and just let it all out on stage was they would they would say Van Halen, the other would say Van Halen, and they would high five each other and run out on stage with the full energy of like the Van Halen vibe. And that was like the thing they said that night that Dimebag died was, they just said Van Halen, give each other high fives, went out on stage, and, minutes later, the tragedy happened. So that was like the last words that Dimebag said to Vinny, which is just profound and just, crazy. But it makes all the more sense that Eddie was there and he gave him the guitar, and it's just such a touching story.
Wow. Yeah, that reminds me of when I was in Cause for Revelation, our code was George St. Pierre. And the reason that we would say that is because George St. Pierre is a very famous UFC fighter and one of the greatest of all times. And his motto was, practice should be harder than the actual fight. So we would always have that mentality that we would practice harder than when we played shows, so that when we played shows and we gave it our all, it would come across that, we should be out of breath at practice. We should be sweating at practice, just like he did. But it's funny how bands have those little code words.
Yep.
So maybe when I die, George St. Pierre will like put his gloves on my coffin. If you're listening, GSP. But
I'm sure that'll
the
happen.
very last Fehlauer fun fact for you, both being from Wisconsin, in the liner notes for Van Halen 2, they thank the Sheridan Inn of Madison, Wisconsin, because on Van Halen's first tour, they stayed at the hotel, that hotel in Madison, Wisconsin, and destroyed the 7th floor. They had fire extinguisher fights. They threw televisions out the window, and they blamed the whole thing on Journey, who they were on tour with.
Awesome.
So they thank the Sheridan Inn in Madison, Wisconsin. Just a little fun one for you.
That's cool.
So let's jump back to your number 5, which is Women and Children First. Anything else you'd like to add about that album? Great album art.
No, not really, I don't think. Let me just check my notes though. No, I think we kind of covered it when we were talking about yours. The only thing I would add is the last song, Simple Rhyme, I think is a great track. It's got sort of a Zeppelin-y kind of feel to it with the different sections.
Yeah, definitely.
But nope, that's it.
You know what that sound means? It's time to head into the pit. In this segment, we pit 2 or more things against each other in the ultimate fight to the death. In this week's Into the Pit, we have a face-off between the 2 major bands formed upon David Lee Roth's departure from Van Halen. In one corner, we have the brand new David Lee Roth solo band and virtuoso supergroup featuring the likes of guitarist Steve Vai, bassist Billy Sheehan, and drummer Greg Bissonette. In the other corner, we have the Red Hot Van Halen coming off their latest release, 1984, and now featuring new lead singer and former Montrose singer / guitarist, the Red Rocker Sammy Hagar. Nate, your thoughts?
I think it's an interesting time period for both bands. If you call David Lee Roth, a band, and you call
this is 1985 too, I should clarify.
Yeah. You call the Van Halen brothers and Michael Anthony another band, because they're both at this point. I mean, they're trying to find someone to fit in and continue their success. They're looking for the best talent out there. And, it's a real challenge because there's a lot of bands, but not a lot of availability of people to fill their spot. So I just think it's interesting that, David Lee Roth, he kind of got the best musicians that are pretty much out there at the time. Yeah. Steve Vai, Billy Sheehan, and what is it, Greg Bissonette?
Yep.
On drums. So it's kind of like he was trying to replace what was an awesome band already that he had, obviously, with Eddie. How do you replace Eddie? He did pretty good with Vai, although I think the skill is there, but I feel like the feeling and the emotion is maybe a little less. Then on the other side, you got Van Halen looking at all sorts of artists, everything from like Patti Smith to like Daryl Hall to like just all these really random people. I think they tried Steve Perry. They wanted to get him in there. And they ended up with Sammy, who was a good fit. I had heard that Ted Templeman actually way back in the early days of David, he wanted to bring Sammy in because he had worked with Montrose before. And he actually thought that Dave wasn't going to be a good singer. So he was actually thinking way back then, he was thinking about Sammy. Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is like they were both trying to like find the perfect fit, and I think they both found a great talent.
Yeah, and like when Sammy comes in, to put it in perspective, he had already done 2 Montrose albums, 8 solo albums, and a supergroup with Neil Schon of Journey. So his resume was like stacked. So I think, like you said, both sides are trying to replace somebody with somebody equal or better, and like better as in better on paper, but maybe not better in the band. I think you and I talked about this before, but the closest comparable situation would be Black Sabbath. So they have Ozzy, who is irreplaceable. David Lee Roth, also equally irreplaceable. But what the band did was they bring in Ronnie James Dio, who is more talented technically. Like he can sing any note. Sammy can sing any note. If you're wondering about David Lee Roth's like singing abilities, like technically, go Google the Running with the Devil vocals only track on YouTube. After you listen to it like 20 times and you die laughing, then you'll start to observe that like what do you call that? Like fundamentally, he's not a great singer, but he has the intangibles of being David Lee Roth, where he's making all sorts of noises and mumbling and doing things and whistling, and he does that cool dual octave thing when he sings.
Yeah, that kind of duotone. I don't know. It's like only monks and David Lee Roth can do it, I think. It's like a screech. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I think lead singers are probably the most recognizable component in a band. So it's like seeing Sebastian Bach. Would you rather see Sebastian Bach solo or Skid Row with no Sebastian Bach? It's like I almost would rather see Sebastian Bach solo. Like,
yeah,
Judas Priest was fine without Halford, but you want to see Halford. Like he's the guy. I think that Van Halen had a very good 11-year run, though. Just like Black Sabbath with Dio, it's almost like 2 bands. The Hagar stuff is its own entity. And in watching like a lot of live video, the coolest thing was Van Halen with Sammy Hagar. They could play Sammy Hagar songs, they could play David Lee Roth songs, and they could play new Van Halen songs. So their like catalog was freaking huge.
So which of the 2 do you enjoy more? Do you enjoy the David Lee Roth albums or do you enjoy the Van Hagar?
Well, I thought I knew the answer to this. At first I was like, no brainer, David Lee Roth. He's so cool. His music videos are so cool. But when I start tapping into the robustness of the catalog, I realized that the Dave awesomeness is very compacted to a very limited amount of time, whereas Sammy, his longevity was much longer. Living in Paradise is like probably my favorite DLR solo song, but the rest of that album actually isn't very good. Yeah. And I was surprised to realize that upon re-listening, like, and then you hear that like Sheehan and Steve Vai left right after that album for undisclosed reasons. And the album was like really proggy, and I'm a prog fan, but like the album that followed that was actually more David Lee Roth sounding, I thought.
Yeah. Are you talking about A Little Ain't Enough?
Yeah. That seemed like a little bit more Van Halen-ish.
I think he got Jason Becker on that one. Also amazing guitar.
That's what Dave did a great job with. He had Steve Vai, he had Jason Becker, he had John Five, like all these like phenomenal guitarists. Like
Yep.
that's the way to do it. That's the way to like hitch your wagon to somebody that's super talented.
But I guess you
Um,
lose that feeling of a band, though. I mean, obviously, it's
especially with
going under the name David Lee
the
Roth.
revolving lineup.
Yeah,
I assume that him out on solo tour, he was doing Van Halen songs. Um,
yeah.
so
I mean, I
what
think,
else?
yeah. I mean, I think David Lee Roth. He has more of that eclectic. He's almost got that like lounge singer. Uh, some of his songs, he goes a little bit farther, I guess, eclectically in the song choices. You never really know what the next song is going to sound like with David, and you go from anything from like fast, like blazing soul, or syncopated between bass and guitar, and the next one could be, something like Sensible Shoes, where he's kind of like a chill vibe, and it's all over the board. Where I think the Hagar stuff is pretty much straightforward. There's a lot of keyboard stuff. There's a lot of ballad stuff. There's a lot of songs about love. It's a little more of a solid package.
Yeah, I think
David's
that
got the hot hits though.
I give Dave so much credit for going out on his own. It's very hard to go solo. It's very hard to be successful at being solo, and he did that. And when it comes to like the '80s, he's still embracing. He's still David Lee Roth, hot out of Van Halen. But like I said, after that kind of dies off, you realize that Van Halen still has Michael Anthony on backups. They still have Eddie Van Halen playing guitar, and you have
Mhm.
Alex Van Halen on drums. And Sammy is a phenomenal singer, guitarist, frontman. Uh, and like I think I told you, it's like I would hang out with David Lee Roth for one night, but I could hang out with Sammy for a week. Like
Right.
they
Yep.
kind of have a
Exactly.
different vibe to them.
Mhm.
So I personally, I'm gonna go Van Hagar, even though I thought I was gonna go David Lee Roth. I'm gonna pick Van Hagar, Van Halen with Sammy Hagar as vocals in this Into the Pit. How about you?
Yep. Yeah, I guess like you, I was kind of surprised because I always remembered, yeah, loving Dave, continuing after Van Halen. But I just feel like David Lee Roth, he has like some really cool hits and a lot of fun videos. But Van Hagar, they just have the more of a solid feel, like a solid band,
Yep.
which I think in the end is going to be a lot stronger.
All righty. So let's continue a little bit on our journey, and by continue, I mean let's go back to the beginning. Um, so we're gonna go all the way back to Amsterdam, Netherlands. So starting there, Eddie and Alex, they grew up in Amsterdam. They're exposed to music at an early age. Their father is a jazz musician as well as a classically trained musician. Eventually, around the age of 5, I think there's like a 2-year difference between them. So I don't know if they were 5 and 7 or 6 and 4. What I don't have the specifics on that, but
They were young kids, yeah.
yeah, in the '60s, they emigrate to Southern California. They basically get there by their father performing as a musician on the ship. Um, I know that he brought his sons up there, so you got these 2 little kids playing pianos. Everyone loved it. So music is very important right off the bat. And by the time they get to California, they are, first discovering rock music, and they put together their first band at a pretty early age. So their first band was called the Broken Combs, which was later renamed the Trojan Rubber Company in 1964. And they start jamming on
Look at that
with a
picture.
hundred
Wow.
kids, with 100 children in the band.
That guy's really tall in the back.
um, so in 1972, they changed their name to Genesis, which sounds like a really great name. Like that band is going to be super successful, which they later find out is super successful in England, where Peter Gabriel is the lead singer at that time of Genesis. So then they changed their name to Mammoth and started making their rounds in the local scene.
Yeah, actually, they ended up, Mammoth was already apparently taken by another band that was somewhat local. That's what I heard from that. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, Genesis and Mammoth, I mean, they're pretty common names. You got to
Yeah.
do something more original.
Yeah, coming
So
up in the
Dave,
metal
so Dave
coming up in
comes
the
in and
metal
he's
scene,
like,
you realize like how many people like try to use the same band names.
yeah, I'm sure they checked all the domain names online, right? Yeah, Dave comes in and he makes a great suggestion that they just go with the brother's last name. He thought it sounded cool, kind of in like a Santana way, like just using the name, and he thought it had a good feel like that, like it just rolls off the tongue, right? Van Halen. So yeah, then they brought in Mark Stone on bass, and apparently he was a pretty solid player, but not for very long. He kind of wanted to move on pretty quick within a year or two, right?
Can you imagine? Yeah, he quits like the year that they get their big break to play at Gazzari's.
Yep. He probably regretted
he
it till
even
the day
designed
he died earlier this year.
the early logo of Van Halen was designed by Mark Stone. But yeah, like you said, he quit the band. Like, oh, can you imagine? Like, you just be that close to greatness, like to be have the rest of your life taken care of, and you're like, yeah, I gotta do something else. So
he's up there with like Pete Best, right?
Yeah. So they're playing at Gazzari's. The significance there is Gazzari's was on the Sunset Strip. That's also where the Doors got their first big break. So there's some, interesting crossover there. And then in 1976, they're gigging at a place called the Starwood. And the significance of that is that a little man named Gene Simmons, maybe not so little, maybe on giant platform dragon shoes, he comes in and somebody mentions to him, hey, come check out this band Van Halen. And he's like, oh, that's cool. And he produces a 29-track Van Halen demo tape entitled Zero, which you can check out on YouTube. It's awesome. Like,
it's great. Yeah.
It's
super good.
It's a little bit heavier almost because it's a little looser, and but the songs sound like the same as almost the debut album. 29-track demo. They record that at Village Recorder Studios in LA, and they do post-production and overdubs at the very famous Electric Ladyland Studios.
Yeah, so at the Starwood, Warner Brothers executive Mo Austin and producer Ted Templeman saw them play, and they brought him in for a contract soon after, which turned out was not the greatest contract in the world. They got for quite a deal. Basically, the band was making like 70 cents per album. Pretty bad, pretty horrible. And on that first tour, pretty much each member made just over $100 per show. So like pretty sad situation for our boys in Van Halen at the time.
Wow.
Which they eventually remedied after the first like couple albums, but those first couple albums, the first tour they went out in 1978. Of note is the first show at Aragon Ballroom in Chicago, which I don't know if you've been down to Chicago for shows, but that place is still going.
I don't think I've been to that venue, but I'm familiar.
At least it was until this year, right? We'll see what happens. So they played that show. They were opening for Montrose and Journey. And that's kind of how they got their first tour going on this first album. And pretty much they blew the other bands away like every night. It was like their first tour, but even though they were the opening act, and it was kind of funny, like the way they set up the stage, the backlining.
Yeah.
Where you have all the kits and the amp in the back, and then the first band is playing with everyone else's gear behind you. So they had like the smallest little square of a stage on their first show. And I think they were actually wearing like these huge like Kiss boots that show. So not only were they like tripping over chords and each other, they had these huge boots on. It was all very awkward. But anyway, they were blowing away all the opening acts that whole first year. Eventually,
Yeah, that
they
seems
went
like
on later in the year to actually
yeah, that
open
seems
for
like
Black Sabbath.
yeah, I was gonna say that's like a trend that like just continues.
Yep. And the funny thing about the Black Sabbath opening was Ozzy and the other guys had talked about when they were looking for an opening act, they had just had Kiss open for them on a previous tour. And basically Ozzy was like, he was like, screw this. Like Kiss is like blowing us off the stage every night with their awesome, this is the glory days of Kiss with full makeup and all the theatrics. They're like, these guys are blowing us off the stage every night. We got to find a band that's just a plain LA band. He was just like, bring somebody in out of LA, one of these new bands, come up and comers, whatever. Then we'll be able to put on a great show and not be like coming in like with trying to make up for the awesomeness of the first act. So what are they bringing in Van Halen, like hot on their first tour on their first album?
Holy
Big
crap.
mistake.
And at that point, they were known as Daddy Longlegs, right?
That's what Gene wanted him to be. Yeah.
Gene really pushed him. He really was going to get him signed. It would have been interesting to see what would have happened if Gene would have stayed involved. He wanted them to rename as Daddy Longlegs, but Kiss's management is the one who stepped in and said, these guys, I think the quote was, they have no chance of making it. So
right. It's so crazy. Yeah.
Now they're lighting up Black Sabbath on stage.
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty wild. You had a story about that tour, didn't you? With Steve Perry.
Oh yeah, I was going to bring that up later.
Oh, okay. Cut that out. Cut that part out.
We're live, ladies and gentlemen. Let's like just some added notes though, like the Gene Simmons stuff. What I found interesting too is the way that Gene sings. Like he has that like bluesy deep rasp to him. That's actually the same way that David Lee Roth like does that. And I don't know if that was something David Lee Roth was already doing or if it was something that in the studio with Gene, because there's a lot of that on the demo, the like really deep bluesy singing.
That's a good point.
Which became part of his rapport. So I'm just curious if that was like a Gene thing. I also thought the demo had many sensibilities that sounded like Kiss, like the it was like more of that like rock and roll sound from the East Coast.
Yep.
And one last thing, before we kind of get into some of the stories about Van Halen was, I know you had some information about like the development of their logo. Yeah,
this was a funny thing that I just kind of uncovered in the book that I just read by Noel, what's his name? Noel Monk.
Yep.
At one point early in Van Halen's touring and career, they had sort of a scuffle with their manager, Marshall Burrell. And basically what they ended up doing was, this was like right when he was on his way out, right before Noel came in, basically raided his office and like everything related to Van Halen, right? So they're taking posters and shirts and all this stuff out of the office, just throwing it in a huge box. And Noel Monk took that box and just threw it in his closet and just never looked in there. And years later, he looked in there and he found this old poster flyer for Jimi Hendrix, and it had this logo on it. And if you look it up, if you're just listening, look up like 70s Jimi Hendrix logo or 60s. I don't know what era it actually came from, but it has a striking resemblance to the VH logo with the flying wings, because it's a JH and a J sort of forms a V shape. But it's just uncanny resemblance. It's like barely changed at all. If you look at it, it's like obvious plagiarism, I would say. Yeah. But it's funny that it really never came up. And I wonder if that's because maybe they just used that treatment for Jimi Hendrix like one time and it was like soon forgotten by the artist.
What I would assume. That's what I would assume. And also I think of like as a musician, a lot of times you're like influenced by other musicians' artwork or whatever. When you're developing it, you never think that you're going to end up being the biggest band on the planet. Like they're probably like, when he's finding that, he's probably like, oh, this band will never be as big as Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah.
Little did they know the number of T-shirts that will have that Van Halen logo on it from now until eternity.
Yeah. Another interesting little sidebar to that, Noel Monk was very instrumental in the merchandising for Van Halen. He had a background in like T-shirt printing and so on. So he actually, normally a band would work with like another company, right? Like a distributor, producer to create all the merchandise.
Yeah.
Noel Monk actually took that as a side business to his managing, and he was able to control all the merchandise and actually enforce it on the grounds too with the bootlegger
Oh yeah.
merch tables that would appear, outside the stadium.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wherever they played. So anyway, the point of that is that they made a ton of money on merchandise, these guys. And it was in some cases actually pretty much equal to what they were making, through their contracts for the albums and the concert tours. So it's just kind of an interesting little fact. I don't know.
So Burl what was his first name?
Marshall Burl?
So is that related to Milton Berle?
I have no idea.
He's the guy who managed Rat, right?
Well, Milton Berle he's a comedian in the 80s, 70s, 80s. He just happened to be in Rat videos.
Oh, I thought the connection was because of their manager.
I mean, I could be wrong, but I always thought Milton Berle was just a comedian.
Yeah, I thought it was like his nephew who managed a bunch of those bands. So I was just curious if he had gone from Van Halen to Rat.
Oh, maybe that was, maybe you're thinking Marshall Berle was the connection that brought Milton Berle into the bands. Yeah, that could be.
I think so.
That sounds possible. Do you know what label Rat was on?
No, but definitely a major.
If it was Warner Brothers, that could be the tie-in.
So Van Halen, the legendary status of Van Halen extends beyond just the music. Like there's so many stories, endless stories, some that are unsubstantiated, but many that have been confirmed over the years. I think probably the most famous story, maybe we start with that, is the Eminem story. If you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I feel like this might be the story that people know or have heard, from Van Halen antics, right?
Yeah.
So generally, like bands that are touring will have a rider. They call it a rider contract or whatever. And it pretty much just ensures a lot of things that the bands need for backstage and like who they can bring backstage and different safety precautions, maybe like for on stage. So a lot of bands will have this, and the length will kind of vary as to what you're asking for. You might say like this much like food and beer backstage and so on. Well, the one that Van Halen's famous for is they said they always wanted to have M&Ms brought backstage, but they wanted to have all the brown ones removed before it was placed in whatever bowl or whatever. And I think a lot of people kind of thought like, well, what a bunch of assholes. Like that's such a shitty thing to do, because all it does is it makes some little intern or assistant have to like dig through this, this package of M&Ms. But really, I guess what it was meant for was as an indicator that Van Halen could kind of look at it, and if they saw some brown M&Ms in their bowl, they might be like, well, what else did you skip, in our list?
Absolutely.
And that could be a big factor as far as like on stage, safety, or just, how the stage is set up. They want it to be consistent. So it was kind of a little indicator, but it was kind of just it from the outside, it kind of just seems really eccentric, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, it makes absolute sense. And I saw, like they mentioned, if there's brown M&Ms, then where's the 50-foot of cable that they're supposed to have stage set?
Yeah, right.
Like, how do we know that they're going to follow those? And if you ever have a chance scouring the internet, you can look into like other bands' riders. There's some ridiculous.
I'm sure there's some pretty silly ones.
I think you had made mention earlier, and this also confirms your rogue pick of Fair Warning as your number 3 pick. But Noel Monk and the Van Halen team, they had to pay nearly like $250,000 to secure that radio stations would play Fair Warning enough to keep the platinum album streak alive. So it's interesting because, like I said, they had 2 diamond albums. The diamond albums are the self-titled debut and 1984, and then everything was multi-platinum in between there. But at the time, they were in danger of not hitting that, keeping that platinum streak alive.
And I think that album was kind of where Eddie started to take more control of the production.
Yeah.
And I think that created almost a case for Ted Templeman and David Lee Roth to kind of think that Eddie was not correct in how he was producing. Because this album was very much Eddie doing what he wanted to do. And so in a way, it was kind of like sad for Eddie because it was like, he was wondering, like, is it something I did on, that made it not sell?
So we're huge fans, you and I, of Michael Anthony. Like, what a guy. Look at this guy, his personality, his look, his vibe, everything. I can't say enough good things about this man, but some other people didn't feel so much about this.
Yeah, I mean, I just remember looking at Michael Anthony and just thinking, like, who is this guy? Because he didn't fit in the stereotype rock and roll image. I mean, he had the facial hair, first of all. The 80s, you don't have facial hair.
That was a no-no.
I mean, sure, maybe in the 70s, that could have been a thing. Some facial hair. You had the long hair, but in the facial hair, I don't know.
I had a lot of facial hair in the 80s.
and also, he not in this picture here, but he kind of had a receding hairline, and he basically, with the beard and all that, and in his stocky build,
the
guy looked a little bit older. He looked like, who's this? Is this like a dad rocking out here? But what we know now is, like, he was just like this kind, like, gentle guy, like soft spoken. Sure, he kind of let loose on stage a little bit, and sure, he liked some Jack Daniels and whatnot. But generally, he was kind of just, he played bass. He did his job. He was good. And especially the background vocals. I mean, that is Van Halen sound. A lot of the choruses, if you check it out for Van Halen, are entirely background vocals. If you think about it, I mean, Running with the Devil, that line is sung only with background vocals, and Dave does his thing around that.
Yep.
And he was just, he was a great guy. I think he was like a former athlete from high school, and pretty much almost kind of a clean cut kind of dude. He married his high school sweetheart, so he wasn't, messing around too much probably on the road. He always had his girl from the beginning. Just a great guy. But then he started to get, like, treated a little poorly right around 1984, where everyone was basically clashing on the road. These guys were on the road all the time in the studio. So at this point, he started to kind of be a little bit of a lesser player in the band, and they were giving him shit all the time. And at about that point, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the rest of the band turns on him, and they cut off all royalties from Michael Anthony, even retrofitting it to that album of 1984. They said, you will not, even though the album's been out and it's our biggest hit ever, they took away, like, all his royalties from that album.
Why? Like, so, how did they justify that?
Because basically they were saying, you didn't write any of the music that was on the album.
Holy
so
crap.
Even though you're a great performer night after night, and you're a huge, element in the band with the background vocals and the great bass playing, like, I know, how do you justify that? He performed on the album. He performed live every night.
Though, I think on that album, Eddie played, like, I think that Michael Anthony only played on like 3 songs. I think Eddie played bass.
I know, later on, especially, Eddie
probably not by his choice.
It kind of reminds me of, like, later Beatles era, where Paul McCartney would just go and, like, grab all the instruments and just play drum, bass, whatever, guitar solos and all that. I think Eddie was kind of between Eddie and Dave. I think they were both, their egos were getting away at that time.
Yeah.
So that really diminished Michael. And you could say the same for Alex, but of course he's the brother with like the main guy in the band, so he's not going to get the shit, you know.
Yeah, it seems like the Van Halen brothers, like I said earlier, there's like these camps, and like it seems like the Van Halen brothers hold big grudges. So
Yeah, for
no
sure.
matter, it's like you look in doing some research for this, I watch a lot of interviews, and in the interviews, they're depending upon what year it is, they're like saying, "Oh, so Sammy's lying, Dave's lying, like
Yeah.
Michael's lying," and it's like, okay, so everybody's lying but you.
Yeah,
Very,
totally.
very interesting.
Yep, things were definitely clashing. And you know, I kind of wonder then, I didn't really find anything about once they transitioned to Hagar, like did Michael kind of cut into the fold a little more? Because we know he was there throughout that whole scenario with Hagar for the, you know, whatever it was, 4 albums or whatever they did.
Yeah, it seems like Michael and Sammy, he really hitched his wagon to Sammy's wagon, and so when Sammy leaves, Michael goes with him, and he's done a lot of projects with him since, I should say, and
Yep.
uh, it's pretty cool to see their friendship, which seems pretty healthy.
Yep.
When you see
Yeah,
them
those
in
guys definitely
interviews,
bonded.
they do a lot of interviews together, which again, when you look at Van Halen, you would get like, here's an Eddie interview, here's a Dave interview, and they're everybody's kind of on their own, doing their own thing. But so at least he got to come back and play on the new album in 2012, right?
I think so, but that was also a weird time too, because I think there was weird contract stuff going on there where he was basically like a hired hand at the time.
Yeah, I don't think he played on that album.
Yeah, I think he played live. I think he might have thrown down some background tracks.
Because Wolfgang was brought in.
Wolfgang was brought in, and that was super odd. Yeah, yeah. Thanks for bringing that. That was really messed up. When they brought Wolfgang in, they actually deleted Michael Anthony's picture, his whole picture from their early albums. They took him out of the, like on the website. Yeah, on their website, say like Van Halen 1.
Yeah.
They actually put Wolfgang in that picture of all 4 of them. Yeah, just for one day. It happened for one day, and then there was an uproar or something. They put it back.
Yeah, you can't do that.
Yeah, they took his picture out, and I guess what other album is he on? Oh, Women in Children First. Somehow they took him off there too. I don't know. That is bizarre behavior.
They just put child face on his body.
Maybe, yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. I kind of just hate that whole thing about it. It's just like you don't even want to know about that, like that side of, Eddie and Alex doing that.
Oh, we got a listener question here.
Oh boy.
Nate.
Oh boy.
Can you tell us a bit about Eddie Van Halen jamming with Limp Bizkit?
Yep. Okay. I know some of our,
and that message was sent in from Limp Bizkit fan 420.
Okay. Yep. I know some of our younger listeners grew up with bands that weren't as great as Van Halen. Let me look in my notes here. Yeah, this is a very important story here. Okay, so this is like pretty recent, actually. Well, this is like in the 2000s when Limp Bizkit had their day with, I don't know, their music. So it was weird. Like I think some of the record execs like knew both bands, Limp Bizkit and of course Van Halen, and they made the suggestion that, okay, Eddie, go jam with Limp Bizkit and see what comes up, man. This could be great for, a resurgence of love for Van Halen or something. So Eddie went and jammed with them, and he pretty much was jamming with them, and they were starting to like smoke a lot of pot and shit. And apparently at this time he wasn't into that anymore, and he kind of just ended up like basically walking out the door and like leaving the party and left all his gear there. And he said the next day, he was like, man, that was a horrible experience. He was like, it was like a teacher and like some new students, basically on level wise, as far as musicianship. So he had to, of course, go collect his gear like the next day, and apparently he had purchased in some previous year an actual assault vehicle. Like I don't know, I'm picturing like a SWAT vehicle or maybe like some sort of military, almost like tank or something.
Which is a very Limp Bizkit move, might I add.
No, this is Eddie.
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm saying, though. Like,
oh, you're saying it fits them.
Yeah, they should have been kindred spirits because he bought a assault vehicle.
Yeah, so Eddie's got this assault vehicle that he drives through LA into Beverly Hills. This thing has like guns on the back and all this shit. He's cruising down the street. He parks it right on the lawn, this huge house in Beverly Hills where they practiced. And he runs to the front door. He's got like his hair up in a bun. He's got no shirt on. He's got just ratty old jeans tied with a rope and huge combat boots wrapped up with duct tape or something. He's like looking like a crazy man.
I'm assuming he's all shredded at this point too.
He's probably in the shredded phase, where he's just got the Phil Collins pecs and six pack. So he runs to the door with an actual gun. And Fred Durst answers the door, and it's said that Eddie held the gun right up to his stupid red hat and held it right on his head and said, "Get my gear, load it up now." And I guess Fred Durst was like, he sent his guys to like grab all the gear, and like he hustled it out to this huge military truck on the front lawn. Meanwhile, Eddie's sitting there, smoking a cigarette, no shirt, and just like holding the gun up. Just crazy. That's like, oh, I couldn't believe that story when I heard it. It was just like the wildest but awesomest story.
Yeah, that's how I imagine LA. Like that's how I want to always remember it. And
so yeah. Sorry, dirt. I love it.
It's kind of like Escape from New York or Escape from LA.
Thanks for bringing it up, Crystal.
So you had alluded to this earlier when we were talking about Van Halen going out on their first tour, opening for Montrose and Journey. But there is a very famous guacamole incident. There's a very famous guacamole incident in which David Lee Roth and Eddie kind of, start fighting a little bit. And it's said that, Dave throws some peanuts at him. He throws like a container. At that time, it was like kind of like the Dean's French onion dip kind of a container. That's what guacamole would come in. And he threw that. He returns fire. He throws it at Dave's head. But instead, Steve Perry opens the door right as this is going on to be like, "Hey guys, great show tonight." He's all dialed up. He's ready to hit the stage because Montrose is on at the time. And he's wearing his very nice Journey custom satin Journey. It says Journey on the back, tour jacket. It's his favorite jacket. Well, the legend goes that Steve Perry's jacket gets hit with this green guacamole, and he runs off crying, runs to the bathroom, cleans he's attempting to clean the guacamole off the jacket. So for many years, this was like an unconfirmed story. And then Steve Perry finally came forward and said, yes, this did happen. He says he didn't cry, but he also says that he was very, very sad and upset and ran off, and it was his favorite jacket. And I can't imagine, like, you're about to hit the stage, your Journey, you're the biggest band on the tour. You were happy because the openers rocked it and you just wanted to be like, hey, great job. And then you end up getting hit with some guac. He probably got charged extra for it too.
Yeah, amazing story. Yeah, he said he never felt the same about Van Halen after that. That's amazing.
To be a fly on the wall with those tours.
Yep.
Another famous incident would be the Beat It incident.
Oh boy, we've got some serious stories here tonight. Yeah, so right as they were working on 1984, or maybe they were done with it. But anyways, that era, Eddie all of a sudden he got a phone call from Quincy Jones. And he didn't even like really believe it at first. He was like, shut up, that, prank call, whatever. But he ended up talking to Quincy Jones, and Quincy Jones was looking for a hot young guitarist to come in and play on Michael Jackson's, I don't know, was that his second or Thriller, the Thriller album. So he had this track, Beat It, and he wanted a great guitar. So he's like, Eddie, will you do me a favor and come on in? Eddie's like, sure, no problem. Eddie's thinking like, yeah, whatever, I'll just rip through a solo, no big deal. So there is a rumor that Quincy Jones offered him 2 6-packs of beer to do it. There was no money offered at all. It was just done as a favor. So Eddie goes in, he's just saying like, no big deal. It's going to take me a half hour to do this. He didn't even bother to like write up a contract or anything. So Eddie goes in, Eddie, I think, said he brought his own beer, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, the beer there, Eddie was smoking like a chimney. The rumor was that he was so loud that like no one would even stay in the room except for what's his name? Don Lundy, his engineer. Yeah. So everyone pretty much leaves. Michael Jackson leaves. It's just Eddie and the engineer in there. Eddie listens to the track. He's like, I can't play over just he wanted to play over just the dun just like no chords. So Eddie's like, I want to change it around. Not only am I going to play the solo, I'm going to change the actual song.
Yeah. So imagine Quincy Jones, who's like a mastermind musical arranger and creator. And then you've got Eddie Van Halen, who's also a mastermind music creator. And like to have those two being able to collaborate is beautiful.
Exactly. Yeah. It could only be awesome. And then Eddie made it even better because he was like, clip this here. I want to play over this pre-chorus, then through the chorus, then this track here. So they were clipping up the tape and like changing it around. Eddie lays down like two takes, right? It takes him like 20 minutes. It's a ripping solo, as we know. Michael Jackson comes back in the room, and Eddie's like, I hope I don't mind I change the song. No big deal. And Michael's like, oh, it's good. Michael's like, I like what you do with the high part. And so he loved it, basically. And of course, Quincy Jones loved it too. And I guess the rest is history. Basically, Eddie did it as a favor, didn't make any money. And the irony is that track won Record of the Year. And it made their album 1984 second.
Oh, geez.
And he did it all secret too, because the band had sort of a pact that they weren't going to play on other, musical projects. And of course, it got found out because it was like so Eddie. You can't mistake it for another guitarist. And so it came out, and he was just like, oops, so what? I did it, whatever. But I guess David Lee Roth is kind of a little bit mad about that.
Yeah. There's speaking of Quincy Jones, there's an incredible Quincy documentary on Netflix. Highly recommend it. Even if you're only like somewhat familiar with him, you suddenly realize how much music he has touched. Like he's created so much famous stuff. And then obviously Fresh Prince of Bel-Air was him too.
Just what?
Yeah, what a amazing American creator, I guess is the way to put it.
Yeah.
Another thing about that,
favor,
Another thing about that story that I heard was that part of the deal was dance lessons. Eddie wanted was he wanted the 6-pack of beer, and he wanted Michael Jackson to give him a lesson in dancing, which I guess happened. Like I'm sure he just like took 10 minutes to show him some cool tricks. Yeah. But and then wasn't there some story about him being in a record store and hearing that song over the PA?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he was in some record store in LA. He was just hanging out. He was just flipping through the vinyl, and they played it on the speakers, and 2 kids were like nearby, and they were like, wow, that sounds like Eddie Van Halen. That's cool. And Eddie tapped him on the shoulder, and he's like, that's me. So man, the cat got out of the bag in a hurry.
The last little fun story is about the Edward Van Halen tape that is in the tape player in Back to the Future. when Michael J. Fox's character is Marty McFly is waking up his father. It's funny because it doesn't just say Van Halen; it says Edward Van Halen, and it is indeed Edward Van Halen on that tape, and he himself confirmed it was just noise that he made.
What's funny about that is if you look at it, the image there, it almost looks like someone wrote Van Halen and then like added Edward.
Yep. I'm sure that was like the goal was like, we're going to write Van Halen so people see the band, but then to make it like legally safe, we're going to make it be his full name because that's his legal full name. And then there's no connection to the band, even though the band is more famous than the man.
Yeah.
Especially at that time.
There. And of course, later in that movie, he plays guitar and he does like some Eddie sort of licks on when he's playing at the prom.
Yep. Good stuff. So as we move on, let's move a little bit into the later years of Van Halen. Obviously, you've got Dave as the singer, then you've got Sammy as the singer, then you got Dave as the singer, and then Gary Sharon steps in, then Sammy's back, and then David Lee Roth returns. So, and if you line up just right, it's like you are one of the singers too in the pictures. You kind of got the similar David Lee Roth hair there, actually, at the end there. My hair looks a little bit more like Sammy Hagar's, the one with the sunglasses, but
oh, totally, mop top.
The red rocker right there. So I would have assumed that if the untimely passing of Eddie Van Halen, I would assume that we would have seen Sammy back in the band soon. I know Wolfgang talked about, you would refer to it as a kitchen sink tour, where they were talking about maybe bringing back all the members. I don't know. Well, how do you think that would have worked?
I think it would be probably a pretty big disaster. Definitely. I mean, it's like a cash grab. I mean, I don't know. It's just weird. The whole thing starting with Gary Sharon and on is just a mess. Just whole big ball.
For me, I wanted to see the Hagar reunion because, again, I missed that too. So it took me so long to see David Lee Roth.
Yeah.
And then after that, I'm like, okay, well, now I want to kind of have the full picture, and I would like to see Sammy Hagar and Michael Anthony back in the band.
Yeah, that would be cool.
Those guys are doing cool things. Chickenfoot's awesome, with Satriani on guitar and Will Ferrell on drums.
Will Ferrell is great. SNL fan.
Chad Smith from Chili Peppers. Great band. And then, they go on to form The Circle. Sammy Hagar forms The Circle, which is, again, with Michael Anthony, this time with Jason Bonham on drums and Vic Johnson playing guitar, who's actually in the Wabaritas as well, which is another Sammy Hagar band. That guy never stops. Like, he's always creating music.
It's impossible to really delineate any of the later years with these guys. There's so many. I mean, basically they just like play music with anybody that's good and available. I mean,
yeah. And when you're all those guys that he jams with are the kind of guys that can play any song. Like, you just name the song and they can play it. And I think they have a lot of fun with that. It's very much like a party atmosphere. Before the pandemic hit, we were going to go to the local amphitheater here to see The Circle play with Whitesnake, which would have been really cool to see Whitesnake in an amphitheater again. And then The Circle, which would be the closest thing. It's half of Van Halen. So the closest thing to seeing Van Hagar in live. They're going to do Van Halen songs. They're going to do Montrose. They're going to do Sammy Hagar solo, which, again, there's so many hit songs that Sammy wrote prior to joining Van Halen.
Right. No, that would have been an amazing show for sure. I'd be all in on that.
The rendition that we saw was the last version of the band, which was with David Lee Roth, old man Eddie Van Halen with the goatee, and young Wolfgang on bass, which is controversial. They replace Michael Anthony with Wolfgang Van Halen. The advantage is his name's Van Halen. Like the advantage to Wolfgang, I guess. Like if he has any excuse to be in the band is that his dad and his uncle said, "Hey, join our band."
Yeah.
Okay. You know, you don't really have a choice than to say yes when you're a 16, 17-year-old kid.
Yep. Yeah, I'm not a fan of that whole thing of bringing Wolfie in. I mean, I get it, but it's just, I mean, it's the greatest example of nepotism you could ever imagine, like kicking out whoever just to bring in your son.
Like I said, it's not like Wolfgang went out and proved himself like he was some master bass player or shredder or followed in his father's footsteps in any regard. Like he's trying to be a musician like his dad, but he's not. We'd kind of talked a little bit about Jason Bonham. Maybe like if he came in and played drums for Zeppelin, it's like, okay, I can understand that because he went out and cut his teeth and made a name for himself and proved that he's a quality drummer. I don't know how good Wolfgang is, even after playing in Van Halen. Like, I don't know anything about him.
Yep. Yeah. I don't really agree with that, but that's just me.
I think the only way right now to see anything close to Van Halen would probably be to go and see the Circle play. They're probably going to play a bunch of Van Halen material. There was Wolfgang in an interview said there was supposed to be a planned farewell tour. The farewell tour would have probably been like that kitchen sink thing. It was said that the openers for that tour would have been Metallica and Foo Fighters, which would have been like the tour of the year, the tour of the decade, whatever you want to call it. One of the biggest rock tours of all time. To see those two bands opening for Van Halen, it would make complete sense. But unfortunately, that never got beyond the planning stage because Eddie just never recovered. You know, his health continued to decline. I think everybody hoped that there would be a reunion. If there wasn't a full reunion like that, it probably would have been Sammy and Michael back in the band. Wolfgang said he was happy to step down and let Michael Anthony come back into the band so they could have that final closure to what they were doing. But
I do respect that. I respect that from Wolfie.
Yeah, and I mean, like, he's never going to be short on money or short on opportunities because his name will forever be Van Halen. So the doors will never shut on that gentleman, and I wish him all the luck.
One thing I would say about I really think Sammy, his voice is probably held up a lot better than David's.
Yes.
I really noticed that David's, vocal really went down in the later reunions. He was starting to like just speak the lyrics more than try to even sing. He was never, and like technically, vocally, he was never like great. And I think it only got worse. Unfortunately, but he's still when we saw him, what was it, like 7 years ago or whatever?
Yeah.
Something like that. I mean, he was still that great showman though, and like the great ringmaster and the great, banter king between songs, which, in that respect, yes, I would love to see both of them and enjoy the full, it'd be pretty wild to see the full cast all united on stage though.
Well, and interestingly, Sammy and Dave did go on tour at one point as solo artists. So they would alternate nights who was opening, and kind of a weird pairing, but I think that's kind of cool. I will say that most recently, last year, we caught Crystal and I saw our second show from the Kiss farewell tour. So it's like the next leg of the same farewell tour. It's going to go on for a few years here. And David Lee Roth was the opener. I will say Dave was nothing short of awesome. Like you said, he was the ringmaster. He was making the jokes and the banter, and he can still sing. He can still do his thing. Not at that level that he was able to do before. The part that was disappointing was the band he brought out was a glorified cover band. So you just didn't have the talent to back him up. And it's like, it's amazing to see somebody like David Lee Roth. If he's got Van Halen, they're the ones that are headlining the arena and the stadium and all that stuff. But when he doesn't have that band, he's an opener and that's it. And he has a short set, and it was great to see him. It was great short set. He played all the hits you want to hear from him. But what I would really love to see is a reunited version of his solo band. Get get Steve Vai out there, whether that's like a Vegas residency or it's a full tour. Especially now that there really is no Van Halen, to carry on that tradition, to carry on tribute to Eddie. I think it would be great to get the solo band back together. Get Sheehan on bass, Bissonette on drums, and Steve Vai, and do the solo material, do the Van Halen material, get a strong opener, and hit the road. I think we'd all love to
amazing.
see.
Just one more thing. So you got this up. I thought this was hilarious. Check this out. This is a quote from David Lee Roth. Contrasting his personality with Hagar's, since they knew each other on tour. So David Lee Roth says this of Sammy: he's the kind of guy you go out with to split a bottle with a friend. I'm the kind of guy you go out with if you want to split your friend with a bottle. And typical Dave, I kind of just barely understand even what he's talking about, but I think I kind of get it. That's Dave,
Yeah. Yeah. There's no one like him. Like, that's the cool thing. Like, I have nothing bad to say about him. And some people, it's like that beginning area from late 70s to late 80s, that was David Lee Roth, and anything we get from now on out is cool. It's just not going to be the same. Another comparable artist, totally different genre, but Marilyn Manson, really cool in the beginning until like the late 90s. And then nothing's been the same since, because it was such a volatile artistic creation that once it hit a certain point, it just fizzled out and it went away. And you can't recreate that magic. You just can't.
Right.
And with David Lee Roth, you can't recreate. He can't become that guy he once was. It's just not possible. But thankful we have it forever. It's music is eternal. There's my word of wisdom.
Right. There you go.
So, the main point of today, if there's any takeaways, is to pay tribute to Edward Van Halen. He's a guitar hero, a pioneer. He changed the face of music. We owe him a great debt of gratitude for what he has brought this earth.
Yeah, his leaping skills were amazing. Look at that. No, his body definitely took a toll from the jumping. That's one thing he always
had to replace a hip.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, talking about Eddie, I mean, he always knew what he wanted from his guitar, and he knew the sound, and he knew, even technically, instrument-wise, what he was looking for. And in the beginning, I think maybe it was a matter of he couldn't afford to buy exactly what he wanted, or it wasn't even available in the area. But he was always looking for and willing to alter anything that he bought. Like a lot of people, they buy their guitar or they research what kind of guitar they want. He kind of just went and he found what he could, and he made what he wanted with what he found, if that makes sense. So that's how you come up with the Frankenstrat.
Yep.
Which was him trying to combine basically a Les Paul with a Stratocaster. And so he would purchase cheap materials like the neck, the body, the pickups. He'd make it all. He basically, what he said at one point was, because he had a lot in common with Les Paul, the creator of the electric guitar.
Yeah.
We never set out to be inventors. We just set out to make what we needed because it wasn't available, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
It
Yeah.
was, it was like, you know, what's the term? The mother of invention is, what is it called? Necessity, or I forget what the term
Yeah.
is, but you know
I
what I'm getting
forget.
at. You make what you need, basically. So yeah, he
Well,
combined a lot of elements. Many famous guitars. You know, you're looking at the Bumblebee guitar and the Frankenstrat, which went through many paint jobs and many modifications. New pickups. He would angle the pickup to fit a humbucker where there used to be, you know, a different pickup that was a Strat pickup, like a single coil or whatever it was. I think it was like a P90 or whatever. So constant modifications, different tremolo bars. He would put a coin under the bridge to control the tension on things. I mean, you know, it's endless. The
people
modifications are endless.
people make excuses like, oh, I can't afford a PRS guitar or whatever. You know, I can't play like Eddie because I can't afford that kind of equipment. But the reality is, like, he was inventing things with cheap materials. Um, he spent $80 on the maple neck, $50 on the body because it had a knot in it.
Yeah.
The tremolo from the 1958 Strat, he replaced it with a Floyd Rose arm later. It had a single Gibson bridge pickup from a Gibson ES335. And I thought it was really interesting. We were talking about this yesterday, but he enclosed the feedback with paraffin wax to
Right.
reduce the feedback that was coming. And even the red paint on the guitar was Schwinn bicycle paint.
Yeah.
So again, stop making excuses and go out in your yard and build a guitar, damn it.
Yeah. I don't know, no one's doing custom paint jobs and like modifying their own equipment. Like no one does that. I mean,
No.
he had the one guitar that went through many different looks. You know, it started out with this paint job. He would put some tape across it, paint it again. Now it's black and white. Now he's going to add red. You know, or look at the Shark guitar. You know, that Destroyer that he had, that Ibanez Destroyer. He ended up like taking a saw to it and cutting out a huge chunk and adding these little connectors on the bottom. I mean, you know, he was a madman. And that's just the actual constructing and engineering of a guitar, you know, not talking about the technique on the guitar.
Yes.
That's a whole nother, you know, ball of wax or whatever. You know, you talk about wax.
Well, when we talk about that ball of paraffin wax, we I think the most famous thing he's associated with is the tapping, right? Like he brought tapping on the fretboard to the modern rock world on a very large scale level. You know, going back in history, Niccolo Paganini, the famous violin master, he was doing that kind of stuff on the fretboard, but that was a violinist. Eddie takes that, he applies it to modern music, and you don't have any of the modern metal or the 80s glam metal or anything like that. The thrash solos, you don't have any of that without Eddie Van Halen, because he created something brand new. He's an innovator. He, you know, he would play with his back to the crowd so that people wouldn't know what he was doing at first.
Yep.
The next person I think of that probably had like such an interesting style is probably like Tom Morello, you know, where it's so different than anyone else.
Right.
But
Yep.
But yeah, it's not just the equipment, it's the style in which he played.
Yeah, I feel like he just knew like every sound you can create within the entire guitar, right? Like whether you're playing like above the nut or something, or you're playing like palm muted stuff here. He was an expert in harmonics, which is where you basically break the string, the length of the string with like maybe your right hand as well as your left hand, by like just lightly tapping. You know, you create that, you basically divide the tone. And you also get the artificial harmonics, which create those squeals that he's famous for. he was an expert in using that whammy bar for the deep dives, and he was skipping his pick up and down the strings. I mean, just like he knew every sound that could be created, and he used it like on every recording, as well as, you know, the famous like using phaser pedal and the echo. And even as far as his amp, I mean, he bought that 220 volt Marshall that was he didn't know it at the time, but it was an England model. There's an English model, so it was like 220 volts instead of whatever voltage we have here, like 100. So basically, when he plugged it in here in the US, it was underpowered. Yeah. So it took a while, but the sound eventually came out, and he loved the sound, and he was able to realize that the lower voltage or whatever, I don't know, I'm not an engineer, technical electrician or anything, but he kind of realized that by underpowering it, he could get the brown sound, right? So he came up with a variable light switch thing that could control the volume instead of the switch. I don't know. Anyway, look it up online if you want to know more about that.
Well, and until 2005, when it expired, he actually had a patent for like a flip out support device that would be underneath the guitar on the bottom of the guitar. So the guitar would kind of flip up and be parallel to the floor so that you could play the tapping like a piano. And if you ever get a chance to look it up online, hilarious illustration, patent illustration of him playing the guitar with this flip out device that was sent to the patent office and given
it's
a
so
patent
funny
number.
It's a line drawing of like him with his hair, and he's like playing this thing horizontally on his lap, basically. It's pretty awesome.
The last thing I would like to mention too that I think was revolutionary with Eddie Van Halen was his founding of Studio 5150. And I think what it alluded to was how musicians at that point were starting to take back some creative control. You look at a band like Tool, they have 100% creative control. So they take less in how much they're going to get from the record label, so that they have more creative control, which actually makes them more money in the long run because you have a better product. And Eddie was one of those first rogue musicians to, he found Studio 5150, which is the California law code for the temporary involuntary psychiatric commitment of individuals.
Yeah, 5150 Studios is definitely one of his innovations to create his own studio, and I mean essentially take control of all the engineering and mastering on his own rather than trying to set up shop in like someone else's studio. He was able to control all the sound. Yeah,
and Studio 5150, I don't know if my mic was getting a little weird, but Studio 5150 was the California code for the temporary involuntary psychiatric commitment of individuals, which was very apropos considering that he basically was just so obsessed with music, so obsessed with recording. There's tapes upon tapes upon tapes in that studio of him just staying up all night and writing and recording and writing and recording. I don't know if any of that will ever see the light of day, but he was a maniac, and we all benefit from that.
Yeah, I think the other thing is, I mean, he basically had his guitar like attached to him at all times. So the guy was like constantly, just riffing, coming up and just noodling around on the thing. It was just a natural part of his body almost. This guitar was, who else is like that? I mean, you can only imagine like a Jimi Hendrix kind of, as far as just seemingly effortless playing.
Yeah, I think of Hendrix. I think of Slash. I think of Jimmy Page.
Like, I mean, that's one thing.
Probably Clapton, but there's only a few throughout our whole entire history of rock and roll.
Yeah, I mean, Eddie was known to be a huge Clapton fan, and I have where is that now? He basically said he often looked up to Clapton, but he found himself being more like Jimmy Page in that he would play with the reckless abandon and just kind of let his muscles, whatever, let his muscles basically do what they will and just like let it go
That
in more of a Jimmy Page fashion.
that reminds me of a story which you might not like, but
I don't like it already.
there's a great documentary called It Might Get Loud in Here.
Oh, dude, no, don't go
in
there.
which
Don't go
in
there.
which Jimmy Page, they're looking at Jimmy Page, The Edge from U2, which is your like favorite band, and Jack White from the White Stripes. But when you talk about that looseness of Jimmy Page, that comes across when the three of them are jamming. And whereas the Edge is like a very technical player and he's playing very specific within like certain parameters. I put Jack White and Jimmy Page and Eddie Van Halen in that same school of thought where it's like they just like flail their arms at the guitar and magic comes out. Like I can definitely see the connection between Eddie and Jimmy off of that documentary, I guess is what I'm saying.
All right, don't put Jack White in there though. He doesn't deserve to be in there.
He just touches that guitar and it's magic. Jack White's another one, is a good example of people who complain about not having good enough guitars and that's why they can't play. He buys like the cheapest, crappiest. He's got some beautiful modern guitars, but the cheapest Sears Roebuck plastic guitars and makes the most glorious sound come out of it. And I don't know how you do that, but
well, that reminds me of another story. When Van Halen was playing with Ted Nugent.
Sure.
Ted was on the side of the stage and he was hearing Eddie like warm up in rehearsals or sound check. And he kind of came out there and he was like, look, and he was like, Eddie, where's that secret magic box that makes sound? And Eddie was like, I don't really have one. I just big amps and I play like this. And so Ted took the guitar and like tried to play it. And he was like, it just sounded like Ted Nugent, right?
Yeah.
And then he gave it back to Eddie and he was like, come on, what's your secret here? What are you hiding? And Eddie took it back and was playing. It sounded like Eddie, Browntown. And it was just like, it's totally just in how he plays mostly, I mean, it's just like, it's just you have it and then someone else has a different sound. It's not like created by pedals or something.
Coming off of that, Ted Nugent had a similar story where he had a guitar and he handed it to somebody and they picked up the guitar and it just started squealing and making like like all this feedback and reverb and all this stuff. And then it's in Nugent's hand and it was completely under control. And there's just, I mean, I think there's a lot of just selling of souls to the devil, I guess, for rock and roll, but no, there's something magic. It's a gift. Eddie Van Halen was a gift. So rest in peace, Eddie. I'm very thankful for that. Which kind of takes us to our next conversation, which is just the lasting legacy of the band Van Halen. And I think that first and foremost, there's just an impact felt everywhere from guitars to drums to really showing us what that next evolutionary step was in the rock and roll frontman. You have the Robert Plants, you have the Jim Morrisons, and then the next step there, I think, is David Lee Roth.
Right. Yeah, suddenly there was all these long blonde hair guys running around with their shirts off, it only spawned, Vince Neil, Bret Michaels, those types who with themselves, created more and more of that typical frontman kind of aspect, just that wild and crazy frontman with the long flowing hair that just runs around the stage, doesn't play an instrument, doesn't contribute much more than like just being wild and crazy.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just gonna say there's no Sunset Strip, glam rock, LA scene without Van Halen. Like they're the godfathers of that. Teaching people that they can just party. Like you can party and play rock and roll. It doesn't have to be as serious as something like Black Sabbath or Led Zeppelin or something, that you could just be a party band. And a lot of those bands got their start actually partying in houses and apartments.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, just music, just to play like party music. I mean, like music that doesn't mean anything. It's just all about like girls and cars and, fast solos. I mean, there's no like thought or meaning to anything. It's just like fluffy music. And like all the guitarists wanted to be the fastest, craziest licks up and down the neck. That's kind of what you measured it against, was like, how much are you like Eddie Van Halen? Like, what can you do with the dive bombing, the whammy bar, and like fast tapping up and down? Like, everyone wanted to be that.
Yeah. Prior, everyone wanted to be Eric Clapton, and then the bar was set higher. Like Eddie set that bar higher, and Alex set that bar higher, where everybody had to play more technically sound and faster. And I don't know, it just it forced more development of the skill sets. It was no longer just easy to play at the speed that Black Sabbath played. Now you had to play even faster, and eventually you're playing at the speeds of Megadeth and Slayer.
Right.
You can't get from A to B without EVH right in the middle there, Eddie Van Halen.
Yep.
And Alex.
It kind of went two ways. Like, you either like went towards like a thrash, fast, try to do as fast as you can and like as heavy as you can, or to just be like as fluffy and like glamorous and like crazier costumes.
Well, what's interesting with that too is like, I think that the thrash scene and the glam scene equally influenced by Van Halen. That was the, like you said, that's the divider, is that whereas like the thrash scene would be like, no way, glam scene's lame, we don't want any part of that. There was, I think, a mutual respect for Van Halen, because they were kind of both. They were like heavier than the stuff that came before them, but they were also a party band. So everybody grew up with that stuff.
You went like heavy, but you still kept the denim, like Metallica, that kind of route, or you started putting on spandex and more leathery stuff. Motley Crue, Poison.
Yeah, for sure. So in summation, Nate, I mean, I would just say Van Halen, one of the greatest rock and roll bands of all time. My recommendation is, if somebody wants to learn about Van Halen, I say go to Van Halen 1978 self-titled debut. Listen to that whole album. That's where you start. If you want to check out the Hagar stuff, I say you go to 1988 and you start with OU 812. You could start with 5150, but I think that OU 812 is just a more solid album. So for the Hagar era, OU 812. For the David Lee Roth, I say the self-titled debut. But thank you, Van Halen.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think, go back and listen to the albums. That's the main thing. Go back and actually listen to them, because we're all just used to the hits that are on the radio.
Yes.
All the time, especially if you're listening to whatever you do, you do these days, like Sirius XM or something. You're going to just kind of mainly hear the hits. Go back and just listen to full albums, back how they were meant to be listened to, the whole thing, and just kind of concentrate. I mean, that's what I really enjoyed in the last couple of weeks. Like, ramping up to this show is just really just listening. I mean, it's all amazing. Like we said, it's all good. There's very few that are like, there's no duds. I mean,
no.
And you're just going to hear all the intricacies that went into the production, and you're just going to hear how just amazing and raw, like a lot of the track are, like first or second takes. I mean, they left mistakes in there, it's not produced. It's not overproduced. It's just beautiful rock and roll. It's definitely for sure in my top 10 of all time. I mean, if not higher. So
good. All right. You ready to move on to our final segment of the day?
I'm scared.
All right, it's time for our final segment of the podcast, Soundtrack to the Apocalypse. In this segment, our guest is the star of his or her own film. They'll be given 2 minutes to respond to as many randomly presented scenarios as possible. Nate will need to quickly provide the song and musical artist as background music for each presented scene. This is the second time we're doing this, Nate. So
wait, his or her?
Ken Hoffman,
His or her?
6. He got
Okay.
6 completed answers.
But any answer is correct, right?
Well, if you mean it.
Okay. No, it's all serious.
This is
I'm
no
trying to
miniature
focus.
this is no miniature business, Nate.
No.
This is some serious stuff. Remember, once the clock starts, to please unmute your microphone. And as soon as the timer begins at 2 minutes.
Hold on, I gotta have my hand ready here.
All right, get your hand on the buzzer.
Okay. Ready.
All right, the pandemic has turned into the dawn of the zombie apocalypse. All you have to fight your way out of the city is a chainsaw and rollerblades.
Okay. Am I supposed to say a song?
Song and artist that would be playing.
Oh, I'll say Slayer Dead Skin Mask.
Nice. Number 2, it's the late 80s. Your summer job is to run this car wash your uncle left you in charge of. It's old, run down, but if you have enough people go through, you'll raise enough money for the ultimate end of the summer party.
I'll say David Lee Roth, California Girls.
Number 3, it's taken you 2 months to do it, but you finally made it to the summit of Mount Everest. It's the most beautiful sight you've ever seen. You take a deep breath and take it all in.
Oh boy. I'll say Van Halen. Wait. There's Van Halen, Top of the World or whatever.
Very, very good. 4, the only way you're getting out of this post-apocalyptic jam you find yourself in is to win the Demolition Death Derby held by the new United Kingdom of the New Americas.
Oh boy.
Demolition Death Derby.
I'll say Megadeth, High Speed Dirt.
All right, nice. Number 5, you're a clown, but not a funny clown. More like the kind of clown that goes on a killing spree with a shotgun and a can of silly string. They've laughed too long. Now it's your turn to laugh.
I'll say Marilyn Manson, The Beautiful People.
Number 6, headed to Las Vegas to meet with some very important made men. Your crew with you, you and the boys hit the casino floor in style.
Holy shit. Damn it.
Oh,
How many did I get?
You got 5.
Did I beat Ken Hoffman?
Nah, you're 1 short. That actually was question number 6. You would have tied him.
Oh, I was gonna say like Frank Sinatra, but that was like weird.
Oh, that would have been pretty
Seemed
good.
too obvious.
That would have been pretty good. At least we know you're giving honest answers.
Yeah, Ken Hoffman. Didn't even put a question in on the show.
The gauntlet has been thrown. All right. So before we wrap this up, remember this episode is streamed live on YouTube. You can go back, you can listen to it for now until forever. And the following Monday, it'll be available on all streaming podcast services: Spotify, Apple Podcasts app, Overcast, Anchor, Pocket Casts, all of them. Nate, thank you so much for being part of this very special Van Halen episode and tribute to the great Eddie Van Halen.
Yeah, thank you for having me, man. It's always good to it's always a lot of fun to research topics and also hang out with you, man, and talk. I miss it.
Yeah, it's like taking a whole semester in Van Halenology.
Yeah, it's always great to focus your attention time to time.
Absolutely, and great to catch up. Everyone stay safe out there, and we'll catch you for our next episode when I sit down with Ken Hoffman for a Collect and Destroy double feature episode where we'll be diving into the classic National Lampoon Vacation and Christmas Vacation, just in time for the holidays. Thank you and good night.